This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture. I'm your host, Erica Pearson. Let's spin the wheel, shall we? In this episode, we're going to dig into the history of a bar game that is beloved in Minnesota, the meat raffle. Yes, it's the game where winners take home raw steaks, ground beef, or brats as their prize. We're talking about meat raffles today because Maureen Michalski in Minneapolis has been curious about them. Maureen is actually a friend of mine, hi Maureen, and a loyal, curious listener. Here she is.
I did not grow up in a rural area. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, but I've lived in Minnesota for, over 30 years now. And there are a couple of activities that are unique to the Upper Midwest, Minnesota and Wisconsin. And, some of those things might be pull tabs at a bar and meat raffles is another one. So I was curious, how did the meat raffle start? Where did it come from and why?
Reporter Eleanor Hildebrandt looked into this one for us. Thanks for being here, Eleanor.
Thanks for having me.
So glad you're here. Well, I was a little jealous of this assignment, though, I have to say, because it meant that your research was going to a meat raffle. So Where did you go and what was it like?
Yeah, I actually attended my very first meat raffle in Corcoran, Minnesota at a bar called the Stanchion. And they have 2 meat raffles a week, one on Sunday, one on Thursday, and they are packed. They have probably 10 high tops in the bar and then an actual bar itself, and they are all full. The ticket folks, they walk around with a paddle. They sell 1-inch tickets. You get to pick a random number. You don't know what it is, and then you grab the number. Then they ring a bell, kind of like you'd see at a hotel. The bell's to get someone's attention. And then they spin the wheel, a regular paddle wheel that you've probably seen and heard before, and it clanks. And as that happens, some people are quiet. Other folks are yelling their numbers or saying, give me a winner or something like that.
Number 18 for the meat and number 19
and then
for the dollar.
Someone wins. And it's very exciting for one corner of the bar for about 5 minutes as that person goes up and picks their package of meat.
Love it. What were some of the things that people who love going to meat raffles that were there told you?
A lot of people go as a group of folks. So it's either they're meeting their friends, they're meeting their parents or their family. Everyone has to be over 18 to play the game.
Okay.
But they come for the social interaction, not necessarily for the prize. And so people get really involved. They come every week or they come twice a week. And it seems very much like a integrated part of these different communities. And it's quite cheap. It's only $1 to $5 for a ticket. So it's a pretty inexpensive game.
That is interesting. And like pull tabs here in Minnesota, it is gambling for a cause. And how does that work?
Yes. So unless you are playing in a casino in Minnesota, all forms of gambling go to charities or nonprofits in your community or in the community where you are playing. At the Stanchion, it was the Northwest JCs. They specifically work with young people, young kids, getting them some leadership experience. And so these organizations employ a few people who come, they sell the raffle tickets, and whatever money is made, they then pay taxes and expenses, and then they put it to whatever their cause is.
Got it. And about how much does one meat raffle bring in?
So for the nonprofits, meat raffles are not really a big moneymaker. There are only 30 spots on the paddle wheel, so only 30 people in a bar can play at a time. And that's $1, $2, sometimes even $5 for people to play. So that's only making $30 to $60 most of the time. And that's not a whole lot when you have to pay employees and get the meat and all of that. But for the folks who are playing, who only put $1 into the game, they're walking away with $40 to $100 worth of meat at the end of the game if they happen to win.
Quite a prize. So your mission was to get the scoop on the history of meat raffles. So who did you turn to in order to answer Maureen's question?
Yeah, I started by talking to a historian whose name is Bill Convery. He directs research at the Minnesota Historical Society. And I also chatted with someone from the Gambling Control Board. That board regulates all the forms of charitable gambling in Minnesota, and his name was Steve Pearson. He's been a regulator for over a decade.
I found all of these mentions on the internet of the game coming from British people during World War II, pooling meat rations together and playing a game of chance that the winner would take home enough meat to feed their family. So what did Bill tell you about the very first meat raffles in the United States?
Yeah, to quote him, he said there's a lot of folklore around meat raffles. And so a lot of people don't know how this started. They think that it came over from Great Britain, but it was a completely different thing. He said in Britain they did ration, they put them all together and tried to send someone home with enough for their family to eat during the war. Here in the United States, they were playing long before the war happened, and it's also where you win meat. So it wasn't that we had any rations that were then compiled. Yeah. It's a little bit of a different game.
Yeah. So what did Bill tell you about the very first meat raffles in the United States?
So Wisconsin actually has Minnesota beat, which I know people will be probably a little bit upset about. But the very first meat raffle took place across the river in Appleton, Wisconsin in 1905, so 120 years ago. And it took several years for the game to actually make it over to Minnesota. It wasn't ever played here until in Albert Lea in 1978, the very first Minnesota meat raffle came on over.
Well, today meat raffles are above board, legal charitable gambling, but that wasn't always the case, and we'll get into some of that unsavory history after the break.
Hey, I'm Melissa Townsend, and I'm the host of Essential Minnesota, a podcast from the Minnesota Star-Tribune. Each week on the show, journalists take a deep dive into one big story happening right here at home. So come hang out with me and the local journalists from the largest newsroom in the Midwest. You'll get the facts and a peek behind the scenes of how our reporting comes together. A new episode drops every Friday wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like it, rate it and leave us a review. That's Essential Minnesota.
We're back, but before we continue our conversation, I wanted to tell you that this podcast is produced by Melissa Townsend and the music is by Matt Gilmer. Okay, so what did you learn about the, let's say, the more raw history of meat raffles?
Yes, I see what you did there. So in Minnesota, it's kind of always been above board, or at least the history we know from articles and people's journals. That's not really true for our friends to the east. Appleton actually banned meat raffles, so there was kind of a 180 in their community. I found an article in the Appleton Post-Crescent, and it was from the front page of an edition where they declared, quote, "There will be no turkey, poultry, or meat raffles in Appleton this winter if the instruction of the city council are carried out." And then the article goes on to say that the town's butchers and meat cutters had petitioned for a crackdown on the, quote, "raffling off and disposing of meats and poultry in some of the places in the city by games of chance, contrary to the law," unquote.
So the butchers, were they upset about not getting the business themselves, or?
It's not super clear, but it does seem like there was just not a lot of regulation at the time regarding meat raffles across the United States, so it wasn't clear who was taking home the money, specifically in New York City. They have a long history of meat raffles, and Buffalo still really enjoys them. But in New York City, there was a case in the 1900s where police were trying to raffle off a 95-pound side of beef. But the inspector of the city said no because the police officers couldn't tell them where they got the meat. They said that it, quote, "fell off of a truck," unquote, which is a euphemism for the fact that they may have stolen it. So it wasn't really clear where they got the food, thus they could not raffle it off for money.
Got it.
And so there's this kind of history of meat raffles were not always above board. People were trying to raffle off meat that they didn't pay for, or that if they were butchers that they didn't make or create.
Yeah.
In Minnesota, we've had a lot more regulation, but not so much in New York City.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So what is the history of the game here in Minnesota? And it was illegal here, and all gambling was illegal for a long time, right?
Yeah, gambling used to be something politicians campaigned against all the way into the 1940s with former Minnesota Governor Luther Youngdahl. That was his whole campaign, basically, was to crack down on illegal gambling. And in 1978, 30 years after he left office, before casinos, before bingo was in bars, meat raffles were one of the very first forms of gambling allowed. people welcomed it with open arms.
Yeah, so much so that pull tabs and meat raffle, they're like a point of pride culturally. So interesting.
Yeah. Charitable gambling pulls in roughly $5 billion with a B in Minnesota alone. It's a very, very big industry.
So that is a ton of money. Is it all going to nonprofits?
No, the charitable organizations do not take home nearly as much money as is put into the game. So $5 billion is how much the organizations make on pull tabs, meat raffles, bingo, all forms of charitable gambling. Then they have to pay out the prizes. So when you win $200 in pull tabs, you have to pay taxes, then you have to pay operational costs, and then you take home much less money than the billions that are put into the industry.
Got it. So how has the game changed recently?
Yes, so the legislature changed how much it costs to get into a meat raffle. So the ticket price has increased, which will allow nonprofits to take a little bit more back home. So it's not really a loser anymore for them, or at least they're going to break even. The other thing the legislature did was increase the value of the meat that is being won. So even if it's donated to the organization, there's more meat in the packages than there would have been due to those inflation costs probably decreasing the amount of steaks or pork chops that they might be giving away.
Oh, so that means people might be more enticed to play the game.
Maybe. I mean, that was a main driver for a lot of people playing. At least it is in 2026, as I just listened to an interesting podcast from the Wall Street Journal about how there's not as many cattle in the United States anymore because of some fluctuations during COVID. So they're increasing the amount just so people will come and play and actually win something that they can take home and make for dinner instead of making as a side dish or something.
Got it. So interesting. Okay, so was there anything else that stood out to you or surprised you when you worked on this one?
Well, I'm not originally from Minnesota, so I didn't know what a meat raffle was when I came. And it does seem like a really beloved tradition of grandparents will take their grandchildren when they turn 18. So it is a piece of Minnesota history and culture that is pretty fascinating to someone who's not from here.
Oh, very cool. Well, thanks so much, Eleanor.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks to Maureen in Minneapolis, who was curious about the history of meat raffles. That is it for us today. You can read all of our Curious Minnesota stories online at StarTribune.com. And I'm hoping that this inspired you to ask us a question. Send an email and share what you're curious about to curious@StarTribune.com. And in the meantime, stay curious.